morning. I am coming on for my live Q&A. So I hope if you're joining me live, I hope you're doing well. My name's Leslie Sacchina, and I run a grass-based farm called Cylon Rolling Acres in western Wisconsin, where I raise meat goats on pasture. We also have a small flock of sheep. And so I've been doing these lives for a few weeks now just because good morning, everybody who's joining on. Because as I got started raising goats, I learned pretty quick on the management side and then also even on the meat side that it's pretty hard to find resources and information that's out there. And so I've learned a lot along the way, and this is where I want to share. So if you have questions, feel free to comment in here or send them my way later, and I can cover them in a future call. But this morning I am going to be talking a little bit about meat, the goat meat side of things. And I had a question based on that. So I'm going to cover that today and a couple of resources, and that will be it. So a question I got was how, we're starting to sell goat meat, but we're not sure with how many animals to start with. And how long do you grow them out? What feed helps them taste the best? What would you request for cut and wrap? What sells the best? So I'll share a little bit about our journey and kind of where we're at on things. And remember, for everybody's situation and market, it's going to be a little bit different. But when we started raising meat goats, I knew eventually I wanted to be selling direct to customers or working direct with local regional wholesale partners. So part of us raising our goats that way, instead of just sending them to the livestock market, we were able to get over time I've been able to get a better feel of how learning more about goat meat, because unlike other proteins, we really have no cutting standards, no grading standards, even compared to beef or lamb. And so I've just learned a lot along the way versus just selling our animals at the livestock market. So when we started selling our goats, we had initially started selling with the traditional freezer model where we worked with a butcher. We sold wholes or halves, and we learned pretty quick that selling a whole goat, where then they coordinate the cutting with the customer, it just doesn't yield a lot of meat. So it's about, it really depends on the size of the goat, but it ranges from 25 to 30 pounds of meat at the most per head that one goat can yield. And so we learned pretty quick offering a whole goat versus a half just made sense for us in that model. We also would sell primals, so whole goat as a whole after hanging weight from the butcher to our wholesale customers. Those are typically farm-to-table style restaurants that would do their own cuts and breaking down the carcass themselves. And so those were good ways for us to move animals. And as we started to get more into the direct-to-consumer space and wanting to have more of a relationship and be able to better serve our customers, that's when we started moving into selling by the cut and carrying packaged meat from our freezer or from our on-farm storage and selling that. And so when we started really small. I started with, I think it was either 2 or 4 head of goats. I decided if we didn't sell it all, we could definitely eat it ourselves as a family. And so the licensing in our state was fairly reasonable for us. We were able to use a small freezer in our refrigerator that was licensed by our county, again, state licensing. So it was a relatively small investment to get that done. And I found out pretty quick that a lot of customers not everybody wants to buy in bulk. It doesn't matter what kind of protein they're eating. And so we actually sold a lot more than I ever anticipated that first time. And so it's taking that jump is a little scary, but it's, you start small and you kind of, you continue on as you go. And so just that's kind of a little bit about where we were at and how we got started. And I found too that people are interested in buying. It's a good way for folks to try out your meat, whether you're a more specialized protein like our goat meat, or it can be even true with more common proteins like beef, or people eat pork and so forth. So for us, for our processing, so as we've continued to grow our model and how we raise and market our goats, we have taken the approach where we raise our animals for market up to a year of age. And so that's a little bit longer than what you might see in some, I would call it like commodity markets, where people bring their animals to the market. And so every of those markets really have different types of customer bases, and they're based on cultural preferences. As I mentioned before, there's not a lot of standards that's based on research, best practices on when to harvest goats, what age and size. A lot of it, if you see it, is based on just consumer preference, and that preference is just based on background on their experiences of eating and consuming that meat, and it's great reference. So we chose to go about no more than a year of age. Usually it's a little bit, it will be somewhere between 7 to 12 months. For us, part of that is that because we're processing our animals ourselves, our cost per head is going to be for processing is going to be the same no matter the size of the animal. And so if we're able to, we're paying $90 a head per animal to be cut. So if we're processing a 50-pound goat, that yields maybe 20 pound, it yields at least 50% maybe hanging weight. Comparing that to an 80-pound goat, there's a big difference there on our costs. So we are under a year of age seems to be pretty decent for maintaining that good meat quality, but also helping us maximize our cost to process that animal. It's part of the reason why goats are kind of expensive to eat, because it's expensive to process and they're small in size. And so that's helped us manage our costs for us and also for our customers. I've also found too that because goats are smaller animals, even though they're compared to lamb a lot, the cuts of goat meat tend to be a lot smaller than lamb, and people still get really surprised when they see our chops. I remember the first time, this is going back to like our first experience doing individual cuts, working with our butcher, or our butcher at the time, very experienced butcher. They were like, oh, they're so cute, they're so tiny. And so part of it is also, not that we know that we're a different product, but we also recognize that our meat, the cuts, it's just a smaller animal, smaller cuts, but again, maximizing that cost, maybe getting a little more mileage out of those cuts. So that those are some things that we have done to adjust. We also are grass based, so our animals just take a little bit longer to finish out. And so that's a little bit background on that in terms of age and harvest size. When it comes to how we grow them out from a feeding standpoint, I think it's very similar to other proteins, just keeping a consistent feeding process and management process for your herd, and that may just depend on what your customer base is. So we're grass based, we try to keep it, and so that is what works for us. It doesn't mean you can't finish or, with a little bit of grain. It just depends on what you're looking for. The other piece on that I was thinking about is on feeding as well. Where was I going? Oh, yes. So a lot of our competition up until, I'd say, pre-COVID, now that I say that, I'll probably get some little note on the bottom of the screen, but is a lot of our competition in the goat meat being sold in most stores in the United States has been imported from Australia. And a lot of those goats, much like other proteins coming from Australia, are all grass-fed. They're range-fed. In fact, some of the goats that are sold from Australia are actually wild goats. So it's, if you're looking at what you're competing with, there's that. We're actually, our management style is fairly similar to what imported goat meat is being fed in a very high range perspective. But again, keep it consistent, because that way your customers are, know what to expect with flavor from there. So from terms of cuts we offer a variety of cuts. I found that when you look at like what other goat meat is more accessible for folks, whether it's like buying from a market, maybe in a more urban setting, or buying direct from a business like a farm like ours, or even another butcher shop, it tends to be mostly you can get stew meat. and maybe ground. And so we've tried to offer a variety of cuts just to have some more accessibility for customers and more options. And some of the cuts that seem to do well for us as we've progressed have been roasts, leg of goat, shanks, chops, rib chops, and then stew meat and ground. And just from a meat production standpoint and somebody who is thinking about serving our customers and having different meat options, because goats yield one head of one animal will yield only so much meat. Typically, it will be, if we were to do traditional cuts in one carcass, maybe you might get 1 or 2 pounds of trim, which would be your ground, and then maybe 1 or 2 pounds of stew meat. And that's just how it works. But if you're used to, if some of my friends who are experienced in buying, let's say a half of beef or a quarter of beef, or you raise beef, you get a lot of ground meat. And whereas I think, at least in the U.S., working with ground meat is pretty common, and but it's not, you don't get a lot of meat. So there's kind of this expectation of, we want to have that type of cut offering, but we don't, it's from a per animal head, you actually don't yield a lot of it if you're getting the other cuts. So we've taken the approach that we will typically designate certain animals to be, when we're planning our meat processing, we'll designate a certain group to just be stew meat only, ground only. It just is more efficient for our butchers, but it also helps us manage our inventory and have those cuts that are kind of like common kitchen staples, but also be able to utilize other animals for those higher quality cuts as well. So, and just like other proteins, leg, roasts tend to be, even stew meat, good winter cuts. We're in Wisconsin where it gets cold. It's, the comfort food where chops and ground, and sometimes we'll do steaks too, will be more popular in the summer months for grilling. Okay, let's see here. So for us, we also do vacuum sealed. Any clear option is great. Sometimes you are up to what your butcher will offer. So paper, if that's what you have, you can do that works. But I really prefer the clear and vacuum sealed for longer lasting freshness in the freezer. Of course, the USDA says that you can store meat in the freezer indefinitely. Just your quality may change over time after a year. But I like the clear from that standpoint. And I also like the clear because just like when you buy your meat in the grocery store, you see what you get and you can have a concept of what you're going to be cooking and what you're buying or you're using in advance. And I think that is common for a lot of folks. You probably can think of that on your end as well. Let's see here. Just looking at my notes, from a planning standpoint, when you think about an animal, kind of, and this is always still like I'm conservative on it and try not to plan, but one thing that can be really tough is planning when you, from a farmer perspective, you have animals that are live, getting ready to be processed, anticipating how much meat you're going to yield afterwards. And that's just part of the process. And we got to plan, we plan that when we're planning out our farm club, even from like what I have in my herd to what I can, what I'll be able to serve my customers. And so some of that really is around, the animal will be, yield about 50% hanging weight, but really when you're looking at usable meat, it's about 30% of what the live weight is. And so that can be really helpful for anticipating what you might get back from the butcher, whether that's if you're selling whole animals or even for what you might sell retail. And I found too that if you're doing stew meat with no bones or just ground, that yield is going to be a lot less. And again, that just comes into planning. But with animals that are just small in nature, it's something that you need to be anticipating. Sometimes the first time you process, you work with the butcher and process them, it can be a little bit of a shock. So I just like to share that information of what we've learned for doing on the meat side of things and being able to better continue to serve our customers. One thing is really interesting is we have harvested an older doe for our own use, And I was really impressed with the quality of the meat and the marbling. She was about 3 years old. And so it makes me wonder, like, it makes me, maybe not wonder, but makes me think that we are really early in the stages of understanding goat meat and meat quality and flavoring, and especially in the United States, but I think maybe even across the world, and like really truly understanding goat meat. And so one of the things, I'm kind of a big thinker, but one of the things I would love to do in a few years is partner with the university to do some research on carcass quality based on years, and see, really start to take a look at carcass quality, but also flavor as well, and get a better handle on, like, you know, are we able to offer actually more flavorful meat, with a little, you know, finishing our animals a little bit longer. I just compare it to beef. Beef, typically it's 2 years. I know I'm very generalizing, you know, versus goat or sheep is under a year. So I just put that out there as kind of interesting observations that I've learned along the way. A couple of resources related to meat, if you're interested in that from farmer perspective or just curious in general. I know I've talked about this book a lot, but Adam Danforth has this butchering guidebook, and it's not just about the harvest, but it also outlines a lot of the cuts of meat. And so I found it very useful for understanding how what type of cuts you can get from certain areas, because obviously certain cuts you can't get if you already have a certain cut already. For example, when we get steaks cut, it means we're not getting as much roasts. So there's some things along that line that book can be very useful. And then I also, on my website, Grazing with Leslie, I also have a meat goat primer book that I wrote last year, where I pulled together a lot of the resources that are out there that I've used over the years and what I've learned when it comes to goat meat. And so you can find that on my site as well. So if you have any other questions, let me know. I'm going to wrap it up now, but if you can comment below, or I've got on my blog, I will post the replay of this live along with the show notes, some more details on what I covered or a summary, and then also a link if you have questions on other topics related to raising, grazing, and marketing goats in the future. So have a good Wednesday.